So a few weeks ago, I made a video called Guild Wars 2's lowest moments, or Guild Wars 2 at its lowest, something like that, in which I listed out, in my opinion, the worst moments for the franchise, the most terrible decisions, the weakest patches, the most ill-thought-out systems, and moments that kind of led us to where Guild Wars 2 is today. Well, today, I figured, let's do the reverse. These are, in my opinion, the 18 greatest moments throughout the course of the history of the game. So obviously, just like before, this list is going to be highly calibrated and personal to me. I do have an honorable mentions that we'll get to towards the end, which probably will cover some of the other changes that you guys might have really liked, but I was not so hot on. But we'll do that at the end. For now, let's roll through the list in reversed order, starting off number 18 with an April Fool's update, funnily enough, and that was the inclusion of chairs in the game. Obviously, there had always been chairs in Guild Wars. You could wander around the various towns and houses and bars and inns and see that there were chairs there, but you couldn't sit on them. And so this was an update that allowed you to actually sit on those chairs and interact with the environment. At the same time, they unlocked the ability for you to sit on a chair anywhere you wanted in the world, and you could even unlock new special chairs for doing various things. Yeah, admittedly, quite often the gem store, but sometimes it would be an in-game reward, like an RNG drop from one of the harder raid bosses in the game, Doom in the Hall of Chains. Now, I know what some of you guys are thinking, really? One of the greatest patches? It's just a chair update. Well, really, what mattered to me was the context around this update. Sitting on chairs is something you can pretty commonly do in other MMOs. In fact, if I remember rightly, when I went to do WoW Classic and did my review of that last year, it was a feature there, and that was, you know, a much older game from even 2005, but Guild Wars 2 didn't have. That was an omission that I think was particularly felt by the RP community, who had asked the studio many times, can we get this? And the response had always been, no, it would be too complicated to make that many animations for this many character races in terms of their sizes, their models, how they'd all interact with it. It is possible, but it would take a prohibitively long amount of time, so don't ever expect it. And so for years, it was like, oh, Guild Wars 2 doesn't get this basic thing because the studio says it's too hard. Then lo and behold, out of nowhere, as a surprise, and what really felt like a treat at the time, it turned out ArenaNet did have the time, did have the resources, and they got it in for the community. That was the thing that I appreciated most, that sense that not all doors were closed, and as time went forward, any number of things could happen with Guild Wars. They also did some funny stuff with the reveal stream on April Fools. It's low on my list, but it was definitely a good moment. For number 17, I have the Tequila Rising update.
You asked. We answered. And now Tyria will never be the same. Starting this November, buckle up, because Roller Beetle Racing is coming to Guild Wars 2.
A little bit like the chairs update, this really didn't affect any big, profound systems within the game. It didn't make any dramatic changes or interesting movements for what Guild Wars 2 actually is, but it did add a whole extra side feature that I found incredibly fun, and it did it in a really intelligent way. Of course, during Season 4, a new mount had been implemented. That was the Roller Beetle, and they demonstrated with that initial release through some of the adventures that you could do Roller Beetle style races. In a later patch, those came to Tequila. And updates to Tequila are very few and very far between. Various circuits of varying length and difficulty were added to a variety of visually distinct maps back in Core. A good amount of new rewards were added with a currency system for them. There was a decent amount of grind if you wanted to go for the whole set, so it felt like it was a big feature in the game for a while. The studio did say they would add hopefully even more over time, and that hasn't happened, but my fingers are crossed. This was a great, fun update, and even though I'm now done with the rewards and stuff here, I love that moment as I wander around, say, the Brisbane Wildlands, and I see someone warp past me on a roller beetle real fast, and I know that's because they're on the race course, only to be followed by 2 or 3 more people a few moments later. Just a lot of cool stuff came out with the community on this game. I even fondly remember people using tonics to turn themselves into trees and stand directly on the path, thus scaring drivers, even though they didn't technically have any collision. The release did come out with the announcement of a competition to give away a Volkswagen Beetle that was themed like a Guild Wars 2 car. We never heard who won that or saw like the handing over the keys or anything. I'm eternally curious what actually happened there, but the update itself, I was very happy with. At number 16, I have a fairly early update to talk about. Maybe some of you watching this video don't even really remember it coming in, but I'm telling you this was a profound change to the rewards that were in the game and my incentive for doing things in actual real Guild Wars 2 experiences, and that's the Champ Bag update. So for those out of the loop, in the earliest days, the game was filled with various champions that you could fight, champions that would appear if events scaled up too high. They were brutally difficult to take down, especially at launch balance. Usually you'd need a full party of players to do it. And what was your reward? Well, if you were lucky, that champion was itself considered an event, and therefore you'd get a little bit of karma. Usually though, the champion wasn't considered its own event. It would die, and maybe you'd get a blue, maybe you'd get nothing at all, and a little bit of experience that, frankly, you didn't care about. Huge amounts of interesting fights and content in the game was completely pointless. You never felt any desire to go for. That was until the Champ Bag update, which meant that if you killed a champion, you got a consumable that actually gave you reasonable rewards. Good amounts of liquid gold, raw materials, blues, greens, rares, even an exclusive new set of exotic weapons with unique skins that changed based on the category of champ box you got, which itself changed based on the kind of champion that you got. I don't really remember anymore, but I think at launch they even gave you good amounts of karma, essentially meaning any champion gave you rewards equivalent to a dynamic event, if not better, and now they all appeared valid. Now, the thrust of this update I truly love. It's exactly my favorite type of patch, something that revitalizes and extracts value from stuff that the devs put in the game but players aren't focusing on. Maybe it deserves to be much higher on the list, but I have to acknowledge that Champ Bags really kind of destroyed a lot of economies. They created some very grindy, zergy farms that didn't really feel like they had decent equivalents for many months. Talking about, for example, Cursed Shore with all the fire elementals. I actually have fond memories of this one. Frostgorge and Queensdale, which sure, many of us are nostalgic about right now and may even go back to do a little of. But when that really became the be-all and end-all, and the temples didn't look so good anymore, and the dungeons didn't look so good, the update kind of worked against itself to a degree. I also feel Champ Bags were kind of the first step into a real problem with Guild Wars 2 that is only just starting to escape from, and that's the inventory management. Open a box that gives you a box that gives you a box that gives you a box. I feel like that all really began with the success of the Champ Bag release and kind of hit fever pitch during Heart of Thorns in Season 4. Number 15 is a truly epic patch that changed a massive number of things with the game. Could be higher if not for the fact that, in my opinion, this was one of the worst releases for introducing power creep to the game and actually invalidating a lot of old content. What are we talking about? Well, the Lion's Arch Rebuild patch shortly before the release of the first expansion, Heart of Thorns. But the Lion's Arch Rebuild is not actually something I really want to focus on. If anything, I think for many of you guys, that attribute of the patch might leave this whole update on your worst of Guild Wars 2 releases. That's because many people prefer the original, cramped, piratey, rustic feeling LA from launch and not the open field Disneyland form of LA that we get today. Now, I think that a lot of those changes came in because of FPS considerations, FPS issues which most people are more than happy to forget about that existed with old Lion's Arch. Myself, I'm actually fairly neutral on the change to the city. I remember being giddy with excitement to explore it when the new one came in. I remember having a huge amount of fun in the new jumping puzzle that they added, or the Karka hunting thing with the rifles. Possibly I was just feeling starved for new places to go and new things to do and see at that point, so I would have taken anything. But again, I'm kind of 50-50. That's not my focus here. My focus is on all of the class and combat changes. See, this was the specialization update, where they really cleaned up the way that traits worked, completely rebalanced basically every trait in the game, did a pass on all the runes and sigils, giving them more power, more incentive in different areas, making sure that they're consistent with one another. I remember before this release came out, the devs tried to do a live stream in which they ran through all the changes, and they couldn't do it. It was like a 4-hour long stream that just ran and ran and ran and ran because they had so much to say about so many changes. This obviously was laying the groundwork for elite specializations, but all on its own, it was the single most significant combat and class balance update they've ever done, possibly even over, as far as how it felt, the launch of expansions and 9 new elite specializations at once. It wasn't just about class changes either. If I remember rightly, this was the patch that added condition intensity stacking to a bunch of conditions that weren't that fun to build for before, like burning or poison. As with any large change to the game such as this, there are obviously going to be problems, and those problems are why it's not higher on my list. This release actually added so much power creep to Guild Wars 2, it's unreal. Most people mischaracterize Guild Wars 2's power creep issues as something just about elite specs, but it's not that. It's a lot of updates like this, and in particular this one may be the king of them all. I'm pretty sure as far as world boss is concerned, they just went through and doubled all of their health shortly after this release to try and get back to a semblance of what the game felt like before. But that was only for world bosses. Everything else is still completely skewed to this day. Nonetheless, a great patch and really solidified Guild Wars 2's fundamentals. Another system change awaits us at number 14, kind of a combination of the champ bags and of the specialization changes. This was the inclusion of the break bar system to the game. Unlike those aforementioned changes, this one really had no downsides whatsoever and helped round out a weird wriggle with Guild Wars 2's combat that always made the CC game feel unsatisfying. To those that don't know, in the earlier days, big enemies that the devs didn't want you permanently CCing with a zerg of players that was spamming knockdowns and knockbacks and so on, had what was called the Defiance mechanic. What this meant was that they would be vulnerable to the first CC that someone threw at them, but then they would gain stacks of immunity to all other incoming CCs. You'd have to work through all of those stacks to open up their vulnerability, and then the next one would go in. The more difficult the boss, or simply the more that the boss scaled, because more players were around, the more stacks would appear. And the way that this worked was that if you were even a mid-sized zerg, they would gain so many stacks that basically all CC would forever be useless. It would be impossible to break through that many stacks before the boss died. And let's say you did manage to. Another problem would occur where you couldn't quite know who was going to land the actual CC that would do something, and that was a big deal, because maybe it was a thief spamming headshot for a quarter of a second days, essentially doing nothing, or maybe it was someone landing a meaty backbreaker for a 4-second knockdown. But you had no real quality control over that. Even in dungeons, where you might assume that the entire group is in comms and people are being very careful about exactly what stacks they strip, it was an unideal situation. Then came break bars, the system we know to this day, that could use a little bit more tutorialization, but the system itself is brilliant, makes all CC valid, and they can even be creative about the different kinds of ways break bars are utilized and how they affect the creature possessing them. Utilizing more interesting forms of break bars maybe has fallen off a bit in recent years, but the system's there, it continues to work, and CC has now been a fun part of the game ever since. No downsides at all. Number 13 is my first example of a content release. I want to talk about the Tower of Nightmares. The Tower of Nightmares was a collection of 2 releases during Living World Season 1 in which an epic Toxic Alliance building appeared within Keswick's Hills. And it was the first time that Season 1 had shown, with its incredibly speedy release schedule, that it could do something like South Sun Cove again. Add something that feels like a whole new map to the game. And it wasn't just a normal map. It was a map with like a sense of progression and climbing, and with really decent dailies and interesting combat balance and fun mechanics as you climb through, with lots of voice acting and a decent personal story instance at the end with strange clues about the future, and a fun boss and new enemies with specific new animations and models. This was a cool patch. To me, it's not necessarily just about the Tower of Nightmares itself, and I'm sure that the fact that I haven't been able to play it since that window in 2013 has meant I'm being a little overly nostalgic about it. But it's about the fact that Season 1 clicked into place right around now. The releases shortly before the Tower of Nightmares were pretty good. The ones after were all excellent. Preceding the release, they'd even managed to nail those weird cryptic hints and clues as the environment changed and we saw trees being cut down, but had to wonder as to why before the tower itself was revealed. And it's funny and maybe a little bit of a shame, but it's right around now when they started hitting this bar of quality and and quantity to the releases that Season 1 was actually rushing towards its conclusion in favor of Season 2. But I'll always look very fondly back on the Tower of Nightmares, and hopefully one day, in the new era, they get to re-implement it for us to explore somehow. Next on my Guild Wars 2 greatest moments is not even a patch. It's something from vanilla, something that I'm still eternally curious and have lots of fun with. It's a specific area of the world that they implemented. I think they did really fantastically. It's, of course, Garenhoff and the Wizard's Tower. So hopefully you're familiar about this. I won't give you the whole spiel. But in Kessex Hills, there is a village you can visit, and unlike all the other villages and random areas of the world that you could travel to at Core Tyrion's launch, this one had a huge amount of dialogue, a ton of intrigue amongst the townspeople, and in the distance, a massive floating wizard's tower, actually returning from Guild Wars 1, though mysteriously now in a new place. The devs seem to be hinting up a big mystery. There's a gate that seems to suggest maybe there would be a new map we could travel to a little bit later towards the Delesio seaboard, and they really seem to have a strong sense of a story to tell there. And yet they didn't tell that story. And by the time the first expansion came out, they hadn't told the story. And the second, and even today, this area of the world remains an enigma. When so much else has been explored, I still really value the existence of Garenhoff and that feeling of being a new player coming here for the first time and being totally lost in the sinister, strange world that seems it's being hinted at. Who knows, maybe one day there'll be an update and this will appear even higher on the list. Coming at number 11, we're looking at Living World again, this time the finale of a Living World season, and that's the finale of Living World Season 2. A profound moment, because up until this point, the devs had been very cagey about whether Guild Wars 2 would ever pursue the idea of an expansion. Expansions had loosely been mentioned right around launch, that maybe they'd work on an expansion while also doing live updates. Then it seemed to be all about Living World Season 1. Then it seemed to be all about reimagining Season 1 into Season 2. And then finally at the end of Season 2, when I think many of us were just desperate for something more fundamental and traditional to other MMOs, they did it. They announced an X-Pack, and in what a way they did as well, with the conclusion of the story step, 2 cutscenes, a regular conclusion to the story, and then like an Easter egg bonus cutscene that was truly beautiful. I'll put it on the footage in the background for you guys right now. They revealed Heart of Thorns to us, and a date for more information, and the Heart of Thorns news cycle began. This was an incredibly exciting, transformative moment for the whole series that I'll never forget. The end of Season 2 itself, the release 2 being a brilliant patch, was a hell of a lot of fun to live through. Number 10, speaking of finales. Do you know what finale I actually think was marginally better than this? The Season 1 finale. Let's remember everything about the destruction of Lion's Arch. I mean, if we consider this finale to have been a multi-part finale, which I think that the devs did, which therefore includes the evacuation phases and everything between before we take back the city in a massive open world dynamic event that feels like a goddamn raid, with a special personal story instance at the end on the actual Breachmaker, with a beautiful cutscene, incredible music, still some of the best music that they've ever released for the game, the Battle on the Breachmaker track, and an amazing Easter egg suggesting at a new Elder Dragon, confirming some long-standing lore theories that the community had maybe been tapping into. The Season 1 finale was really goddamn awesome, and it's suddenly very strange for me to realize that even though the general bar was so much higher in Season 2, and the content pace was so much slower in Season 2, I actually think there was a lot more spectacle, a lot more to witness and have fun with at the end of Season 1. Talking about being able to go back to the Tower of Nightmares, this content is truly some of the best they've done, and I'd love to see people see again one day. For number 9, you know, it's funny, I already talked about the end of Season 2, but I think the best patch within Season 2, and still one of the best patches for the full franchise, is Episode 5, Echoes of the Past. Let's look at what Echoes of the Past did. It added the Dermond Priory Special Collections, a whole new area to the Priory filled with lore books, and I mean truly filled. Even in future instances where we've got proper lore book UI, or say when Season 3 came out and we got to go to kind of a hidden library looking area beneath the Astralarium in the domain of Istan, the devs have never gone through and added so many interactables, so much information for players to read through, so much bridging of the gap so that Guild Wars 2 players could understand some of the Guild Wars 1 lore, and also just give us new stuff about the current setting of the world. It wasn't just books that they gave us, it was artifacts and paintings and any number of weird, minute things that you could experience. What about the environment? What about the fact that the tail of the slain Elder Dragon Zaitan is hanging overhead? What about the fact that there's a beautiful statue of Abaddon in the lobby that you could / dance at as an Easter egg so that it would kill you? What about the beautiful painting of the Antikytheria mechanism and the hints about the nature of the entire universe? What about the hint that the first letter of the Deep Sea Dragon's name was S? That didn't exist before this release. What about the content itself, with a beautiful animation of all of the books rotating down into an even deeper area, and the return of Ogden Stonehealer, a huge character that really should have had more of a role in all the story preceding it, and now it looked like the devs were looking at. What about the instance that takes us to Glint's lair, itself practically a full dungeon filled with VO and, at the time, pretty unique, interesting mechanics? It's a decent length, brilliant release with a ton of stuff to marvel over. What more could I have wanted? Really, a fantastic patch. For number 8, we're back to April Fools, but this time we're not talking about as simple as just chairs. No. We're talking about a game within a game. It is, of course, the Super Adventure Box. Now, I know the Super Adventure Box is not everyone's cup of tea, but even if you don't like the jumping puzzle stuff, you definitely don't like Tribulation mode, you don't think Infantile mode is good enough for you, maybe you don't even appreciate the unique art style and special weapons that you can get there, you have to appreciate the sheer size of this thing being released as an April Fool's patch initially, followed up with the Back to School release. Back to School is kind of funny, and I sort of bundle it in here on my list because I loved Back to School. Sure, the zones were a bit long, and yes, the difficulty curve was slightly off, but they did so many new and powerful and interesting innovative things with the Back to School release that there's no way I could ever consider it, or the Super Adventure Box itself, to have been bad elements of Guild Wars 2. I think the fact that this stuff, as big as it is, got in the game is a real testament to just how ambitious ArenaNet as a studio can and has been in the past. And sure, it went away for years, and sure, since coming back, they haven't managed to expand on World 3 or 4 yet, but hopefully one day. Even if they don't, the Super Adventure Box is such a profoundly cool thing that I think if I was just told it was a part of Guild Wars 2, but didn't actually see it for myself, I would never believe it's a real thing. And yet it is. Every year, sometime around January or February, I start to miss it and feel, oh, do you know what? I'd really like to play a little bit of SAB. And I know I just have to wait a couple of months till April swings around again, and there it is as a festival. Great stuff. As we climb higher, we start to get to the better releases, and that of course means Season 3 hitting the list. So here at number 7, I want to talk about Season 3's finale, One Path End, and the inclusion of Siren's Landing. So, in general, I do think this is a better finale than both Season 2 and 1. That's why it's higher on the list here. It is itself a part of an incredibly strong season that I'll be talking more about in just a second. But the finale is a little bit of a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, we got to return to Ore, and we hear about the idea of the unclaimed undead, and we see the Sylvari's perspective. We get new insights into the gods with their scriptures. We get to interact with King Razor once again. We get a ton of story about the Shining Blade. We get several mini instances, like going kind of north of the Bandit Brisbane Wildlands Bridge, but not really, and a previously unseen Shining Blade headquarters beneath Divinity's Reach. We get a brilliant new jumping puzzle for the first time in a long time that's not obscenely difficult and won't alienate a bunch of new players. We get a decent karma sync for the first time. There was a hint about the Scepter of Ore for the first time, and so much more. These are all brilliant elements of the patch. They are kind of counterbalanced though by some questionable story decisions, having Norn and Char characters be invested in the Shining Blade, like blatantly killing off Lazarus in a show that they really don't care about some of those other stories, like a kind of clumsy and not that inspired segue into the Path of Fire Crystal Desert stuff with the Eye of Janthea vision, and a pretty rubbish mastery that caused a hell of a lot of map lag, even well after the Zergs had left the map. The reason for me, though, why this patch is still so high on my list is actually not any of that stuff. It's Aurora. It's that this here was, in my opinion, the ultimate golden age of healthy activity for Guild Wars 2 and things to do. We just had a consistently implemented, brilliant full season. There was not going to be a long wait for the next expansion, Path of Fire, and the devs had just introduced a new legendary to the game that everyone would have access to. It's not a weapon and your class doesn't have that weapon. Everyone would get it, and what it meant was that you could go back through all these recent Season 3 maps and play them a ton. And for this beautiful period, right around the Siren's Landing release, you could go to any number of places in Corteria, in Heart of Thorns, or any of the new Season 3 maps and find heaps of players on their own adventure, doing their own thing, everyone with a clear sense of purpose and progression, building towards this legendary, getting ready for an exciting new expansion. That, to me, was the golden era, and really, it was the implementation of Aurora and an overarching goal that catalyzed a lot of that. So for number 6, I want to remind you guys, this is a personal list, okay? Now, objectively speaking, I can't say that this deserves to be higher than some of the stuff we've already discussed. However, for me, as a player, my personal involvement and enjoyment with the game, this has to have been one of the greatest moments for me. We're back in Season 1, actually. It's the Marionette Triple Trouble Worm release, in which 2 world bosses were added. That was it, really. Just 2 world bosses, but the devs did something really kind of genius and beautiful here. They added a world boss that casual players would be able to access, and they also played with the idea of a hardcore boss. Now remember, this is Guild Wars 2 before a formal raiding scene. This was Guild Wars 2, where a huge amount of players were bored of the dungeon scene and had really learned how to trivialize a lot of that stuff and wanted something difficult to fight. And the devs experimented, pre-raids, with the idea of putting that in the open world. There are actually a lot of problems with that, and I don't think that they should be doing that any further. Problems that really were revealed by this patch, such as you want to get hardcore about it, so you have to bully people out of your map so you can get as many guildies in as possible, and you got to police people's builds, and you can only really try a thing every 2 hours instead of at your own timing, and so on. But all of that aside, the inclusion of the Triple Trouble Worm, this incredible threat that EU and NA were racing against one another to see who could beat it first, was fantastic. Genuinely commanding in the most elite, difficult way possible. About 150 people split to 3 disparate sections of the map where there were 3 incredibly difficult bosses to fight, and you had to synchronize the kill on them all. They each had their own unique mechanics, led to me having so much fun, both as someone trying to learn about the encounter and teach people about the encounter, and as just a member of the fighting force trying to take out these epic creatures. The thrill of when we finally managed to get that kill, the excitement of getting a 2-hour power nap just to wake up and the next spawn would be there and we could try again, is something I will not quickly forget. Really a fantastic release. And for number 5, real quickly then, for all the reasons I just said a second ago, it should be no surprise to you guys that the Tequila Rising update is also on my list. Tequila Rising actually comes a little bit higher. It was the same situation. A really epic, difficult, challenging boss out in the open world. Can you deal with it? This patch had a few other things going for it though. It included the introduction of LFG, something the game desperately needed, and it was early enough, basically right on Guild Wars 2's first anniversary, that it was before the mega server update. So for this one, you had lots of separate server communities, and yeah, people would guest around, all going at the boss at the same time. It didn't feel like it was just EU and NA. It felt like a lot more people were in the running, and you could have fun getting familiar with server communities, something generally only World vs. Wilders have experienced since now. I think the fight was, on balance, more fun to play as well than Triple Trouble. Triple Trouble was probably slightly better designed in as much as it split the entire Zerg into separate areas of the map, which helped with like frame issues and maybe server latency and stuff like that. With Tequila, everyone was generally much more centralized, but it had a really robust sense of a single battlefield where everything flows together. The people on the turrets help to keep the boss vulnerable, but then enemies will attack the turrets, so you've got people defending the turrets, and then the battery phase with everybody splitting off, and the giant tidal wave animation and the megalith cannon creating the burst phase. There's so much happening at Tequila that is so fun. Nowadays, with all the power creep, what people really experience is a shadow of that original implementation, but I remember it fondly. I think it will probably always be in my top 10 experiences of this game. Coming at number 4, near the very top of the list now. I think you can probably predict this due to the fact that the Season 1 finale's been there already, the Season 2 finale's been there already, the Season 3 finale's been there. Well, finally, we have the Season 4 finale, War Eternal. And in general, I just have to give mad props to all 3 of the final releases of Season 4. The Jahai Bluffs with all the interdimensional activity and the incredible instance you get in the Mists. Thunderhead with the whole Auditorium, Kralkatorrik boss battle stuff. And finally, War Eternal, fragments of the Mists, areas of the God Realms we haven't seen in Guild Wars 2 yet, shattering through into our land with the body of an Elder Dragon and the final defeat of Kralkatorrik. These patches, and particularly the last one, were truly incredible. You know, it was only recently I did a video going back through that content, trying to keep it immersive, trying to show you guys all these amazing beats that the devs made, like flying on Oreen's back through the mists as you watch and siege Kralkatorrik. This is one of those things where I really can't help but shake the sense the community doesn't value the quality of this release and these releases as much as they should. This wasn't just a story patch, oh no. This added a pretty decent open world meta event that people still do to this day. This was a patch that added a mount, the Sky Scale, which sure, maybe they wavered on a little with the original time gating of its acquisition, but the actual experience and collection of going through and getting the Sky Scale, training the baby and throwing toys for it and so on, was all really well made. This was the patch that added the legendary Greatsword to the game, which has unique animations based on which profession is using it. And the map too had an astounding number of special details, like standing on Kralkatorrik, sometime he'll wag his tail and throw you in the air, or an actual physical airship flying circles around the map below. It's really weird, but I think the story of the layoffs and the revelation that we weren't moving into a new expansion after this release really put a downer on what is otherwise, if you're actually analyzing the patch, one of the best collections of story and content that ArenaNet has ever put in the game at once. Number 3. Now, I think in terms of pure objectivity, the patch I'm about to talk about is not better than, say, War Eternal. But as far as my experience with it, and how much I loved Guild Wars 2, and how addicted to Guild Wars 2 I felt, and how spoiled for things to do in Guild Wars 2 I felt, no Living World release has ever been better than this. And I'm sure you won't be able to predict it. Perhaps it's just a consequence of how I felt on those days and where I was with my life in those days. But it's Season 3's A Crack in the Ice. Now, don't get me wrong, Bitterfrost Frontier is not necessarily a perfect release. The whole coda mastery pretty much falls flat these days. The ludicrously easy berry farm into Ascended gear, thus making stuff like guild missions and commendations kind of pointless, I actually would say have done a lot of damage to the game. A couple of the story instances even feel kind of rushed, like the one in the cave on the very northern section. But this patch, man, this patch really clicked for me. The music, the environment with like the frosty forest and the idea that you would go to each heart and unlock a little bit more of the elixir so you could go into the super cold place. The killing Sons of Svanir so you can actually steal their armor and only with it could you now look different and go and interact with them and get that heart. The hot springs area with that really deep tunnel hinting at maybe something in the depths of Tyria. The new consumables, like kind of the cheaper form of seaweed salad that you could get there. All of this stuff just worked for me. But you know what I think worked the most? That this was a rare example of a Living World release that did something I think ArenaNet should always be doing. It added a Living World patch, and it also added repeatable content to the endgame at the same time. Now, they've done it on a few occasions, but the fact that Bitterfrost Frontier came with all this stuff, and like a legendary you could go for, Shushadu, and it came with the Nightmare Fractal at 4 scales, and the Nightmare CM, and the Infinite Mists Omni Potion, meant that I felt completely spoiled for choice and truly excited about a ton of objectives to go for at once. Like, while I was in Bitterfrost, I was thinking about Fractals. While I was in Fractals, I was thinking about Bitterfrost. And even if I remember rightly, there was a PvP league going on that I was enthusiastic about too. That strong sense of having a lot of things that I know I really want to do with Guild Wars kept me ravenous and enwrapped in a way that basically no other patch has ever managed to hone in on. So really, as far as Living World releases, and maybe this was just personal to me, for the gameplay it offered, A Crack in the Ice was like top tier. So we now have 2 more things to talk about in Guild Wars 2's greatest moments. One of them is a little bit personal to me. though I think is indisputably a great release. And the other thing I think is unquestionably the best thing Guild Wars has ever done, and like so many things on this list, I think goes underappreciated. First of all, number 2, it's a raid release, the Bastion of the Penitent. So this is the 4th raid wing. This wing, I think if you're a really dedicated raid player that's definitely looking for super high challenge, you're going to overlook this one. This release actually, I think, eased back a little bit on the difficulty. Maybe the final boss not included, but certainly the other encounters on their way up. And also it's a wing that we had to wait a while for. You know, the first 3 wings came out real quick. But number 4, there was definitely a bit of a wait, and I think that drops it in many people's estimation. But to me, Bastion is the best raid wing. It's chock full of interesting new art assets, and some raid wings are really light on that stuff. But here, you're the Samurog fight with all the spears, totally unique, special new area and boss that you're fighting. The final fight with Saul and the Deimos Demon Zone encounter, totally new, awesome, badass new art. Even the Massar Overseer and the chessboard, which you'd kind of seen some of those assets before, kind of came together to feel like something brand new. What about after the wing is done? Which, yeah, when you're just grinding it, you don't think about, but new explorable areas unlock, like a dark room filled with whispers and special dialogue that you get to appreciate. What about all the voice acting? And voice acting that changes based on your profession, or your race, or your personal story decisions. Like if you're a human that's been to jail, you'll kind of reference that in the jail section. What about the lore mysteries that they set up and the tension before they introduce Samurog, and the big mystery at the end about the true nature of Deimos? What about the location that the raid's set in the Verdant Cascades, a place that, you know, with Drizzlewood Coast we've kind of been to now, but was an especially curious area of the world on the coasts of the Isles of Janthir? What about the final cutscene, which isn't just, you know, a couple of little camera flybys and a few frames as we see in some of the new releases? It's like a fully made artistic thing with lots of voice acting. Speaking of voice acting, what about how the story develops in kind of an adrenaline-fueled way as you slowly progress through the phases, weaved into the fabric of the final fight, something admittedly some of the other raid wings have done, before eventually you end up inside Saul's demonic mindscape. All this, and the fact that the story subject material is so rich and enticing and especially captivating, specifically to me, who had always been interested in the story of Saul D'Alessio, delivered in the raid format, which is where I think the game shines best, means this has to be, for me, the best release they've ever done. It's not a Living World patch. I think the best Living World patch for me somehow ended up as Bitterfrost Frontier, but this is better than them all. And so that leaves me at number 1. Guild Wars 2's greatest moments. It's not a personal preference thing. I kind of think it's an indisputable thing. I think it's a thing people don't really talk about enough. It's a place that Guild Wars 2 does better than any other MMO, maybe even any other video game full stop. And I really am not that scared to say that. It's the release of Path of Fire and Guild Wars 2's implementation of mounts. What is there to say here, really? These are the best mounts I've ever experienced or seen. It's not like I've played every MMO out there or seen. These aren't just mounts where you hit a hotkey and you slowly charge a bar and you get on it and now you just have a bit of movement speed. These are fully realized, beautiful creatures with idle animations and special combat abilities that you can train through the mastery system. Each is a specific key to a specific lock out there in the environment. Admittedly, that kind of changes a bit with the Sky Scale and certainly to the Griffin. Speaking of the Griffin, the fact that they managed to hide a secret extra mount in the game and the thrill of seeing some mysterious stranger on it around launch and excitedly talking to them about the Griffin, the controls, the Griffin races and adventures specifically calibrated around it. Sure, there are a few things that they could have done even better with the mounts. Maybe the whole thing of like taking care of it and feeding it treats. Maybe the idea of having the mount as a separate entity to you so it like fights alongside you in certain ways. Maybe these things could have been done. But as far as the movement, the animations, the weight, the difference between all of them, I'm honestly amazed that a franchise that really was kind of building an identity around not having mounts ended up being the MMO with the best of them all. The question is now, how the hell are they going to top that with big feature experiences and future X-Packs? Because I honestly don't think that they can. So that indisputably is the top of my list. It was always the top of my list. And you'd be hard-pressed convincing me that any of these other things they've added actually somehow beat it. So there you have it, guys. Those are my greatest moments from Guild Wars 2. I do have a couple of special mentions. First of all, Feature Pack 1. This was a feature pack that added account binding to legendaries, account binding to dies, added world XP to world versus world. Lots of fun and interesting things. Some of them are decisions that I kind of disagree with, that I know many other people really like the account binding stuff. You might want to look at like the world versus world tournament stuff. Big world versus world players might really love or hate that. In some ways, I think the devs actually announced that after the tournaments were over, the metrics showed a lot of people stopped playing world versus world, so I'm not really sure where I sit with that one. Some other big moments just for the franchise are like the announcements of Path of Fire, and when they revealed all of that stuff, and the announcements of Heart of Thorns and all of that news. I don't have those on my list. Now, they were very exciting, fun moments for me, but I can't really comment on them as a regular player because I was actually a part of those announcements and I was kind of in the know about stuff, and I don't know whether I should really put it. So that's a special mention. Maybe you guys look at those as really cool moments. Another big thing as well, like the core Tyria gliding patch, for example, is something I know a lot of people really enjoy, but I kind of fall on a different side of the coin for that, so it's not actually on my personal list. And maybe there's some stuff that I've totally forgotten about as well. You know, maybe stuff along the lines of the champ bag update that I've completely discredited by forgetting about. So you guys can let me know in the comments what would be on your list, what kind of stuff you would shuffle around. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you for another one very soon. If you don't know, I do a daily podcast, or attempt to be daily, about the upcoming expansion, End of Dragons. There should be another part of that. If not tonight, then tomorrow. So take care, guys. Feel free to support the video in any way that you like. That would mean the world to me, and I'll see you next time.